in this era where everybody is talking about how do you integrate ChatGPT into your operations, what is it going to mean? And I want to link this back to a challenge that I know the hospitality and tourism industry is facing globally, and that is a manpower crisis at this point in time. How do the two converge?
So I get this question a lot, particularly in the wake of ChatGPT. And in fact, I spoke at MIT in Massachusetts a few weeks ago, and I had a student raise their hand and say, "Isn't this exciting? Couldn't you imagine a day where you have a hotel with no employees?" And my response was, "My goodness, I hope not." Right? We are in the hospitality industry. And so, of course, technology will continue to drive efficiency in the operation of our hotels. But my hope and my expectation is that what technology will also do is create capacity for our associates so that they have more capacity to really engage in a personal way with our guests.
Yeah, I would imagine a hotel with no people on the other side is going to be a bit problematic. At least I can't imagine one at this point in time. What are you changing in the prototype of some brands like Moxie? I think you just spoke about that. You spoke about the vacation homes expanding in India as well. So I think we've covered some of those questions. So if you have fresh questions coming in for Tony,
although I would make one comment there.
Go ahead.
It's, this debate goes on in the U.S. and I'm sure in other countries around the world every day. But for U.S. companies, I think we're all faced with a fundamental question. Are we a global company or are we a U.S. company that happens to have some operations outside our borders? Certainly our aspiration is to be a true global company. And when you think about growing brands in different markets around the world, your willingness to invest the time and energy to understand the wants and needs of the domestic traveler and customize your brand, certainly maintaining a thread of continuity on a global basis. But we were talking in a meeting this morning about when we brought Fairfield to India. We spent months and months doing focus groups with Indian travelers. It influenced the name we used, it influenced the design, it influenced the service offering. And certainly a US or a European traveler would recognize that it's a Fairfield, but that's a product that is tailored to the local Indian traveler. And I think if you aspire to be a real global company, you've got to have the willingness to adapt and not just pull your domestic prototype off the shelf and roll it out globally.
I think that's an important point that you make in terms of staying global, but also staying relevant to local needs and experiences. Tony, what I want to understand from you from a industry perspective and specifically from a Marriott perspective, sustainability and the efforts on that front, because this is an industry that's part of the problem and needs to do much more as far as the solution is concerned. So specific priority areas on the sustainability agenda that you intend to focus on.
Of course, and I certainly I can talk about Marriott, but it is a challenge for everyone in this room. From a personal perspective, I'm very much of the view that I'm fortunate to be a temporary tenant on this beautiful planet, and I feel a personal responsibility to protect the planet. But even if you don't have that view, it is a business imperative. When I think about the four constituents that we serve, our guests, our associates, our owners, and our investors, all of them are demanding not just flowery language, but substantive goals and demonstrated progress against those goals. So of course we've made a commitment to get to net zero by no later than 2050. We've made commitments on water and energy and the like. The one thing I worry about a little bit, there's so much focus on climate, which there should be, but there are other areas under the umbrella of ESG. Food waste is maybe the best example of that. 40% of the food that is produced in the world ends up in the trash. And you've got food insecurity around the globe. And so I think there are a variety of areas where the company is focused to setting meaningful goals and then publishing annually our Serve 360 report, which demonstrates our progress against each of those goals.
And progress on gender parity, because I know that that is something that you're focused on as well.
It is. It's an interesting question. On one hand, I look and I say our C-suite is at gender parity. What we call our senior leadership, vice president and above globally, by the end of this year, we'll be at gender parity. More than half our board is at gender parity. So we have a wonderful story to tell. And each and every time I share those statistics, my answer is, and that's not nearly enough. Because whether it's on sustainability, whether it's on diversity, equity, and inclusion, I am of a firm view that the minute you are self-satisfied in those areas, you go into a bit of a death spiral. It requires consistent and deliberate focus to achieve the sort of goals that our industry demands.
You know, speaking of consistent and deliberate goals, I want to ask you this in the context of the competitive landscape. And there's a question that's come in. What is your favorite hotel brand outside of the Marriott portfolio? And Chris Nasasha is here as well. So, you know, maybe you want to send out a shout out.
Well, you know, my dear friend Chris is here. I won't say a Hilton brand, but they obviously have a particularly fantastic set of brands. If I had to pick one, I might say Hyatt Regency for a very personal reason. My very first job in the industry, I was a night auditor at the Hyatt Regency in Baltimore, Maryland. Yes. So I would probably say that.
And what about an Indian brand?
An Indian brand? Well, it's hard not to say Taj. I mean, Taj is an iconic brand on a global basis, and I think they have generated some of the world's most extraordinary hotel leaders that have taken that expertise around the world.
Well, I'm sure Puneet Chhatwal is here. There he is. That should bring a smile to his face. But, you know, in terms of trends that we are seeing at this point in time, and I know you have a daughter who is headed into the hospitality business as well, currently studying. But with this generation, the way that they're spending, what they're spending on, the experiential aspect of travel and hospitality, what are the trends that you believe that the industry and you particularly intend to focus on to capture this market?
So this is another trend that started prior to the pandemic, the notion that more and more consumers are shifting their spending from consumption of hard goods towards experiences. And I think the pandemic acted as a bit of an accelerant. That was a trend that you saw in the younger generations. I think across age groups now, there is this deep appetite to invest in experiences. And so as we think about programming our hotels and growing our system, authentic and local are the buzzwords that we use often. If someone travels to India, they want to be with a team that is Indian, that can share their rich heritage. They want to dine on Indian food prepared by Indian chefs. They want to be shown experiences that they don't see in a tour book that are authentic and local. 99% of our associates across our 140 hotels here in India are Indian associates, and we'll continue to grow leadership in that way as well, so we can deliver those authentic experiences.
Authenticity is, of course, going to be a big focus area as far as you're concerned. But, you know, some of the challenges, and we just talked about the high interest rate environment. I mean, the cost of money has gone up significantly. Do you believe that that's going to impact supply in the next few years, not just for Marriott, but for the industry as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, right now what we see, the availability of debt for new construction on many markets around the world is probably the single biggest impediment to growth. I think whether it's us or Hilton, the big brands will get a disproportionate share of the debt that's available. But what you'll see as a result is an uptick in conversions. We talked on the fourth quarter earnings call about roughly a third of our signings and openings being in the conversion category. And the pandemic rattled the industry to its core. We saw our business drop more than 90%. And I think increasingly owners say the comfort of being able to plug into powerful global revenue engines to get the benefit of the reach of the industry's largest loyalty program, that should continue to drive conversion volume, even in the face of a tough debt environment.
What about pricing power? Do you believe that you will be able to continue to hold?
We think so. I mean, in the fourth quarter alone, we saw global RevPAR up 5%, driven by 13% growth in ADR globally. So we continue to see strong pricing power. As I look into 2013, I think our RevPAR growth will be a bit more balanced with contribution from both occupancy and rate growth, but we continue to see strong pricing.
Strong pricing continues for 2023. What would you put down as the single biggest risk that you're monitoring at this point in time, outside of the macroeconomic uncertainties and challenges that we just spoke of?
I don't know that I would call it a risk, but maybe one of the most important focus areas for me is the health of our owners and franchisees. As I talk with my teams around the world, I say we should most certainly take a moment or two and celebrate RevPAR returning to pre-pandemic levels, but then we should quickly pivot and remind ourselves that many of our owners and franchisees are in a very different place on the recovery curve. I wish I could tell you that the expense side of the ledger froze during the 2 years of the pandemic, but it certainly didn't. And so the financial pressure that the owner community continues to face has to be top of mind for us.
You know, since you're talking about that, this is a linked question that's coming from somebody. During the conference yesterday, it was discussed that hotel management contracts are one-sided for operators. What are your comments on this?
I humbly disagree. And that answer will surprise no one. It is interesting. I sometimes get questions about the state of our owner and franchisee relationships having gone through the pandemic. And speaking from Marriott's perspective, I would submit to you, I think those relationships are stronger than they've ever been. Why? Because of the transparency, because of the collaboration and the communication that we had with our partners. It was as if we set aside some of the petty disagreements we have in the course of day-to-day business, came to the same side of the table to try to slay the common foe of the pandemic. And I think as a result of that collaboration, our relationships are as strong as they've ever been.
And I would imagine that more work is going to be done to ensure that this continues to be a much more robust partnership and much more robust collaboration. Given all the levers that we just spoke of, in terms of the outlook for margins, in terms of the return on capital employed, what does the next 2 or 3 years look like?
Well, without question, some of the margin pressure that we see as a result in certain markets of heat, light, and power costs increasing, labor cost increases, combine that with some floating rate debt where you're seeing real pressure on yields. In the short term, that pressure will exist. But again, speaking for Marriott, so many of our owners are long-term investors. They have made a decision to invest in an industry that by its very nature is cyclical. And so they have a much longer term investment horizon as opposed to trying to time the investment for the next quarter or two. Now, the responsibility we have is to help them navigate the areas of that cycle that create the most pressure on their business model. But I think all of us, and particularly if you had any questions about the resiliency of travel, those questions have been answered over the last 24 months. And so most of our partners tend to have that medium to long-term horizon that gives them quite a bit of optimism.
You talked about the resilience of the hospitality industry, and I think that there were many obituaries written about many industries at the start of the pandemic. Travel, hospitality, aviation were just few of them. What has the pandemic taught you personally as an individual, but more importantly as a CEO?
Well, in terms of the industry, travel and the desire to explore the world has been embedded in humans' DNA since the dawn of time. So I don't think that will change. I think the last 24 months is the best illustration of that. I shared with you a quote that I love from the Roman philosopher Seneca, who said, "Travel and change of place imparts vigor to the mind." And one of the things I love about that quote, you mentioned I have a college-age daughter. I'm convinced she thinks travel became popular when Instagram launched. But the reality is travel has been part of what human beings crave forever. And that gives me enormous optimism. In terms of taking on my new role in the face of this challenge, it's really about transparent communication and the value of deliberate listening. Whatever we've done to improve our relationship with our stakeholders, it's a result of not talking so much. It's of sitting and clearing our mind and being deliberate about listening to what we can do to help them grow their businesses.
Well, Tony, that's the perfect end to our conversation. Right. Thank you so much for listening, but thank you so much for answering my questions as well and sharing your insights on what we are seeing in terms of demand, what we're seeing in terms of emerging trends, but more importantly, where the Marriott Group is headed over the next few years. Always a pleasure. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Appreciate it.